Consider what happened in the 300 years after a single execution in a Roman province. At the moment of the crucifixion, the movement centered on Jesus of Nazareth consisted of perhaps a few dozen terrified people hiding in an upper room in Jerusalem. Most of them were from Galilee. The farthest any of them had travelled, in all likelihood, was to Jerusalem for the festival. Their leader was dead. Their movement, by any reasonable measure, was over. 3 centuries later, Christian communities existed in Britain in the west and India in the east, in Ethiopia to the south, and Armenia to the north, in Persia, in Egypt, in Spain, in Gaul, scattered along the Silk Road through Central Asia, embedded in every major city of the Roman Empire, present in places the earliest Jerusalem disciples could not have named on a map and would not have imagined reaching. No armies carried it, no empire mandated it, no single coordinated strategy sent it. It went by ship and by road and by the feet of merchants and tent makers and soldiers and slaves and women who managed household economies and converted their neighbours and opened their homes for worship. It went in letters and in stories and in the calm behaviour of people being fed to lions. It went because the people who had it could not stop giving it away. Tonight I want to tell you the story of that journey. Not the theology, though the theology matters, but the actual physical story of how a faith that began in an upper room in Jerusalem reached the ends of the ancient world within 300 years. It is one of the great adventure stories of history, and almost none of it was planned. Before we begin, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment with your location and the time. It is a small miracle of connection that these stories can gather listeners from so many different corners of the world at once, and I find it genuinely meaningful to know who is on the other end of the words. Wherever you are, I hope the night is kind to you. Let's begin not with the faith itself, but with the world that received it, because the world it entered was, in certain specific ways, extraordinarily well suited to receive it. The Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was the largest and most sophisticated political structure the Western world had yet produced. At its height, it encompassed the entire Mediterranean basin and extended into Britain in the northwest, the Rhine and Danube frontiers in the north, the Euphrates in the east, and the Sahara in the south. Approximately 50 to 60 million people lived within its borders, speaking dozens of languages and practicing hundreds of religious traditions. And yet the empire had done something unprecedented in human history. It had created a shared infrastructure connecting all of these people. The roads were the physical expression of this. The Romans built approximately 50,000 miles of paved roads across their empire, engineered for military movement, but used by everyone. They ran straight across mountains and marshes, bridged rivers, were maintained by local governments, and marked with milestones, telling travellers how far they had come and how far remained. A person in Britain and a person in Syria and a person in Egypt were all in principle connected by the same road network, a network you could walk from end to end, if you had the time and the endurance. The sea lanes connected what the roads did not. The Mediterranean was, in the sailing season, roughly March through October, a relatively navigable body of water, with established shipping routes linking every major coastal city. A traveller in the 1st century could go from Rome to Alexandria in as few as 10 days with a good wind, or from Antioch to Corinth in a matter of weeks. The sea did not belong to anyone. It belonged to the empire, which meant it was open to merchants, to pilgrims, to missionaries, to anyone with the fare and the stomach for an open-deck passage in a Levantine grain ship. The common languages made it possible to communicate when you arrived. In the eastern half of the empire, the language of commerce and education and cosmopolitan life was Greek, not classical Attic Greek, but the simplified, widely understood koine, the Greek of the street and the marketplace, and the letter. A Jew from Judea could talk to a merchant from Egypt, could talk to a philosopher from Athens, could talk to a trader from Syria, all in the same language. This was the language in which Paul wrote his letters, in which the Gospels were composed, in which the faith was transmitted across its most critical early decades. In the western half of the empire, Latin performed a similar function, though the translation of the scriptures and theological writings into Latin would take somewhat longer. The bilingualism of the educated class, Greek and Latin together, meant that someone like Paul, who was fluent in both as well as in Aramaic and Hebrew, could move between worlds that lesser travellers could not. And then there was the Jewish diaspora. This is the factor that is most often underestimated in accounts of the early spread of the faith, because it preceded Christianity by centuries and gave Christianity a network it did not have to build from scratch. Beginning with the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC and accelerating through the Hellenistic period, Jewish communities had spread across the entire Mediterranean world and into Mesopotamia and beyond. By the 1st century AD, there were larger Jewish populations outside Judea than within it. The city of Alexandria in Egypt had a Jewish community of perhaps 1 million people, the largest in the diaspora. Rome had multiple synagogues. Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, Cyprus, everywhere Paul went on his journeys, he found a synagogue already there, a community already acquainted with monotheism, with the scriptures of Israel, with the ethical tradition of the Torah, with the expectation of a Messiah, a community whose God-fearing Gentile associates were already halfway prepared to hear what Paul had to say. The Jewish synagogue was the first address at which the new faith arrived in almost every city. Paul's pattern of going to the synagogue first was not merely a personal preference or an ethnic loyalty, it was the strategic use of an existing network. The synagogue was where people who already cared about the God of Israel gathered. It was where the scriptures were read. It was where the argument about Jesus as the fulfillment of those scriptures could make sense to an audience already prepared. The Jewish diaspora had, without intending to, prepared the ground for the gospel's expansion for 500 years before the gospel existed. And underneath all of this was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Not a perfect peace. There were wars and rebellions, and the constant low-level violence of empire, the brutality of slavery, and the arbitrary cruelty of power. But relative to the centuries before it, and to the centuries that would follow the empire's collapse, the Pax Romana was something remarkable. People could travel, trade could flow, ideas could move, the infrastructure held, and into that infrastructure, at the right historical moment, walked a small group of frightened people from Galilee with a story about death and life. The first scatter happened faster than anyone expected, and from the most unpromising cause. In the years immediately following Pentecost, the Jerusalem community had grown rapidly. Thousands had believed. The community was sharing meals and resources, praying daily in the temple courts, gaining the goodwill of the people, if not of the leaders. And then Stephen stood before the Sanhedrin and said the thing that could not be unsaid, and the stones flew, and a young man named Saul watched with approval the persecution that followed Stephen's death in approximately 35 AD was the first dispersal. The text of Acts 8 is precise. All except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. All except the apostles. The leadership stayed, the community scattered. And then comes the verse that, If you blink, you might miss. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Not those who had been scattered went into hiding. Not those who had been scattered waited for conditions to improve. Wherever they went, they preached. This is the mechanism in miniature. Pressure produces movement, and movement carries the faith to new places. The persecutors thought they were extinguishing a fire. They were scattering embers. The scattered believers went first to places geographically close, to the towns of Judea, to Samaria to the north, to the coastal towns of Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon. Some went to the island of Cyprus, which had a large Jewish community. Some went to Antioch. All of them, in each new place, began to form communities and tell the story. Among those scattered was a man named Philip, not the Apostle Philip, but the Philip who was one of the 7 deacons chosen to manage the distribution of food in the Jerusalem community. He went to Samaria, which was significant. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was historically bitter. They were half-cousins who had been enemies for centuries, each claiming the other had corrupted the true faith. A strictly observant Jew would avoid Samaria entirely on journeys between Galilee and Jerusalem, taking the longer route around it. But Philip went into a Samaritan city and proclaimed the Messiah, and the people listened, and many believed, and the community there began. When the Jerusalem apostles heard that Samaria had received the word of God, they sent Peter and John to pray for the new believers. And when they arrived, the Spirit came on the Samaritan community. The boundary that prejudice had maintained for centuries dissolved in a generation. And then Philip had a more peculiar assignment. An angel of the Lord told him to go south, toward Gaza, on the desert road. He went without being told why. On the road he encountered a chariot, and in the chariot sat a man reading aloud from the scroll of Isaiah, the passage about the suffering servant, the sheep led to the slaughter. Philip ran up to the chariot and asked, "Do you understand what you're reading?" The man said he could not, without someone to explain it. He invited Philip to come up and sit with him. The man was the treasurer of the Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. He was a powerful official of a wealthy African kingdom. He had been to Jerusalem to worship, which means he was either a Jewish convert or a God-fearer, drawn to the synagogue community sufficiently to make a long journey to the holy city. He was wealthy enough to have his own chariot with his own scroll of Isaiah, and he was on his way home, down a desert road, when a man came running up and offered to explain. Philip explained. He started with Isaiah and preached to the man about Jesus. And as they travelled, they came to some water, and the official said, "Look, here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" Philip baptized him, and the Spirit carried Philip away, and the official went on his way rejoicing. He went on his way rejoicing, and he was going home to Ethiopia, to the court of the Candace. What happened when he got there, the text does not say. But the Ethiopian church tradition, one of the oldest and most continuous Christian communities in the world, traces its roots to this moment, to a conversation in a chariot on a desert road between a Jewish believer who had been scattered from Jerusalem and an African official who happened to be reading Isaiah. It is the kind of origin story that sounds too particular to be invented. The Ethiopian church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, has maintained unbroken continuity for nearly 2,000 years. It developed its own liturgical language, Ge'ez, its own theological tradition, its own distinctive practices, including the keeping of both Saturday Sabbath and Sunday worship, and the carrying of the Ark replica known as the Tabut in every church. When the Aksumite kingdom of Ethiopia converted officially in the 4th century under King Ezana, it was not Christianity arriving for the first time. It was Christianity becoming officially established in a country where it had already been present for 3 centuries. The faith that a scattered deacon carried in a chariot conversation had taken root. Meanwhile, in the north, the scattered believers who had gone to Antioch were doing something that would change the direction of everything. Antioch on the Orontes, the modern city of Antakya in southern Turkey, was in the 1st century the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, after Rome and Alexandria. It sat at the junction of the Syrian plains and the mountain passes leading into Asia Minor, a crossroads of trade and culture, Greek in language and cosmopolitan in character, home to a substantial Jewish community and to the full diversity of Greco-Roman religious life. It was the kind of city where every language could be heard in the markets, where ships came up the river from the Mediterranean and caravans came in from the desert, where ideas moved as freely as goods. The believers who reached Antioch from the Jerusalem scatter were, initially, speaking to other Jews. This was the natural pattern. You go to the synagogue, you speak to people who already know the scriptures, you argue that Jesus is the fulfillment. But Acts records something remarkable. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. Men from Cyprus and Cyrene, not from Jerusalem, not from the inner circle, not from the apostles' immediate community, but from the Diaspora themselves, already at home in the Greek-speaking world, made the step that would change everything. They began speaking to Gentiles who had no prior relationship with the synagogue, no background in the Jewish scriptures, no existing framework for the story they were about to hear, and the hand of the Lord was with them, the text says, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord. The Jerusalem church sent Barnabas to Antioch to investigate. Barnabas was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and he was glad when he saw what was happening, and he encouraged them. And then he went to Tarsus to find Paul, the former persecutor, who had been waiting in his home region for his moment to come, and brought him back to Antioch. And for a year, the two of them met with the church and taught a great many people. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Christian. The name was probably given to them by outsiders, by the Greek-speaking population of Antioch, who observed these people gathering around the name and person of Christos and identified them by their master. It was the kind of name that might have been meant dismissively. The Christ people, followers of someone whose name or title they had taken as their identifying marker. But it stuck. And it stuck because it was accurate. Whatever these people were, they were defined by their relationship to a person, and the person's name was what they were called. Antioch became the base for what would follow. Paul's 3 missionary journeys all began here. The church at Antioch is the one that sent Paul and Barnabas out with prayer and fasting and the laying on of hands, a formal commissioning, the community, authorizing and supporting the mission. When Paul and Barnabas returned from their first journey, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them. When there was controversy about the Gentile question, Antioch sent the delegation to Jerusalem. When Paul and Barnabas fell out over Mark, they both still called Antioch home. The city that received the first Gentile converts in significant numbers became the mother church of the Gentile mission. And from Antioch the mission expanded outward, along the roads and sea lanes that the Roman Empire had so conveniently provided. The journeys of Paul have been covered in detail in other tellings, and the basic geography is worth sketching here for its map-like quality. Cyprus, the island off the Syrian coast, reached first because it was close, and because Barnabas came from there. Then Asia Minor, the long western peninsula of what's now Turkey, where Paul established communities in Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra and Derbe on the first journey, and expanded to Philippi, Thessalonica, and Corinth on the second. Asia Minor was crisscrossed by Roman roads and dotted with cities, and within Paul's lifetime it became one of the most densely Christianized regions in the world. The letters of Revelation, written near the end of the 1st century, address 7 churches in Western Asia Minor as if these were well-established and well-known communities, which by that point they were. The Aegean coast and Greece came next. Philippi, the first European community, founded at a prayer meeting beside a river. Thessalonica, the capital of Macedonia. Corinth, the great commercial hub of the Isthmus. From these cities the faith spread into the surrounding countryside and along the trade routes that connected them. Paul says in his letter to the Romans that he has fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum. Illyricum being the coast of what is now Albania and the Balkans, the northwestern edge of his identified mission territory. That arc from Jerusalem to Illyricum is a geographic statement of staggering ambition successfully realised. And then the road that Paul wanted most and took longest to travel, the road to Rome. Rome was not evangelised by Paul. It was already a Christian city when Paul wrote to it, around 57 AD from Corinth. The origins of the Roman Church are obscure. Almost certainly Jewish believers who had been at Pentecost in Jerusalem, or who had heard the news shortly afterward, returning to Rome and beginning the community there. By the time Paul writes, there are multiple household churches, enough people for him to send 26 greetings by name in the letter's final chapter, enough theological development that he needs a long letter to introduce himself and align his teaching with what they already know. Rome received the faith not because an apostle brought it, but because ordinary people moved. A cloth merchant returning home, a Jew expelled from Alexandria by political trouble, seeking a new city, a freed slave returning to the household of a Roman patron. Any of these, or all of them, could have been the vehicle. The faith travelled in bodies in the memory and practice of people who had encountered it somewhere, and then moved on. Rome was the destination of the whole empire's movement, the city to which every road eventually ran, and it was only a matter of time before the faith that was moving through the empire's networks arrived there. What made the Roman Church's position eventually so significant was not its size or its early sophistication, but what happened there in the 60s AD. Peter came to Rome. Paul came to Rome. Both of them died there. The city that was the capital of the empire became the city of the martyrs, and the Bishop of Rome became in time the bishop who could claim apostolic descent from the men whose bones lay beneath the city streets. The political logic of Rome, the centre of everything, the city to which all roads lead, was absorbed into the church's logic, and the bishop of the city that had killed the apostles became the bishop who claimed to speak for the whole church. But the faith was not only travelling west, it was also travelling east, along routes that the Western-focused telling of early Christian history tends to underemphasize. East of the Roman Empire lay the Parthian Empire, which controlled Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, ancient Babylon, the region to which many Jews had been exiled in the 6th century BC, and where a large Jewish community had remained ever since. Edessa, a city in the far east of the Roman zone, on the border between Roman and Parthian territory, modern Ufa in southeastern Turkey, became a major centre of early Christianity, with a distinct tradition that may have reached it very early through the networks of the Jewish diaspora. The Syriac-speaking church that developed around Edessa produced its own theological tradition, its own liturgical forms, its own translations of Scripture. This was Christianity east of the Greek world, not a translation of Greek Christianity, but a parallel development, rooted in the Aramaic language that Jesus himself had spoken. From Edessa and the Syriac-speaking communities of Mesopotamia, the faith moved further east. The Parthian Empire, despite being the great rival of Rome, was not a closed world. Trade moved through it, and traders moved their faith with them. Christian communities appear in Persia within the first 2 centuries, growing large enough to attract the attention of the Sassanid rulers, who would occasionally suppress them with violence. The Church of the East, sometimes called the Nestorian Church after the 5th century Christological controversy, became one of the largest and most geographically extensive Christian bodies in the world. At its height in the medieval period, it had communities stretching from Syria, through Persia, through Central Asia, to China and India. More Christian communities had been established east of the Roman Empire than within it, though this fact would be almost entirely lost to Western Christian memory. The Eastern tradition traced its origins to Thomas, the apostle who, according to a very old tradition, travelled east rather than west, and eventually reached India. The Acts of Thomas, a 3rd century document, describes his mission to India in some detail, though much of the account is legendary. What is not legendary is the existence of the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, a community in the southwestern coast of India that traces its origins to an apostolic mission and has maintained continuous Christian practice for nearly 2,000 years. They have their own liturgy, their own bishops, their own community practices, and a claim of origin so old and so consistent that most historians take it seriously, even while debating the details. When Portuguese explorers arrived on the Kerala coast in 1498, they found Christians already there, Christians whose traditions predated Portuguese contact by a millennium. Christianity in India in the 1st century, carried, according to the tradition, by one of the 12 men who had walked with Jesus beside the Sea of Galilee. The African story runs along a different axis. Egypt, like Rome, may have received the faith early, and through the natural movement of diaspora Jews. Alexandria had the largest Jewish community in the diaspora, and was, after Rome, the most intellectually sophisticated city in the empire. The tradition attributes the founding of the Alexandrian church to Mark, the companion of Peter and Barnabas, and the author of the earliest gospel. And while the details of this tradition are difficult to verify, the presence of a significant Christian community in Alexandria by the 2nd century is beyond dispute. What Alexandria did with the faith was distinctive. The city had a tradition of intellectual synthesis. It was where the Hebrew scriptures had been translated into Greek, the Septuagint, where Philo, the Jewish philosopher, had spent his life arguing that Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture were compatible, where the greatest library in the ancient world had been assembled precisely because Alexandria valued the meeting of ideas. When Christianity arrived in this environment, it encountered the same question it would encounter whenever it met sophisticated intellectual culture. How does this relate to what we already know? The Alexandrian Church's answer was to engage. The catechetical school of Alexandria, traditionally the oldest Christian school in the world, became a place where serious intellectual engagement with Greek philosophy was applied to Christian theology. Clement of Alexandria, writing at the end of the 2nd century, argued that Greek philosophy had been a kind of schoolmaster, preparing the Gentile world for the gospel, just as the Torah had been a schoolmaster for the Jewish world. His successor, Origen, was perhaps the most brilliant and controversial Christian thinker of the first 3 centuries, a systematic theologian who applied the methods of Greek scholarship to Scripture, produced the first textual criticism of the Bible, wrote thousands of pages of commentary and theology, and ended his life imprisoned and tortured in the Decian persecution. Origen's influence on the subsequent development of Christian theology was immense. He gave the Western tradition its methods, its vocabulary, its habit of asking hard philosophical questions about what Christian claims actually mean. He was also controversial enough that later centuries would debate whether some of his more speculative ideas were orthodox. But whether you agreed with him or not, you had to reckon with him. Alexandria made Christianity intellectually serious, and intellectual seriousness made Christianity harder to dismiss. West of Alexandria, along the North African coast, lay Carthage, the great city of Roman Africa, once the rival of Rome itself, now a major provincial capital and port. Christianity reached Carthage in the 2nd century, and from Carthage came one of the most important voices in the early church, Tertullian. Tertullian was a lawyer by training, a convert by conviction, a writer of ferocious energy and rhetorical skill. He was the first major Christian author to write in Latin, and in doing so, he created the vocabulary in which Latin Christianity would think for the next 1,000 years. The word Trinity, Trinitas, comes from Tertullian. The word sacrament in its theological sense comes from Tertullian. The formulation, one substance, three persons, for the nature of God comes from Tertullian. He gave the Western Church its language. He also gave the Church one of its most enduring observations about persecution. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the Church. He was watching what happened when Rome tried to suppress Christianity in North Africa, and he saw the paradox in action. Executions did not reduce the number of Christians. They increased it, the calm of those who died, the willingness to die rather than deny. This was advertising the movement could not have planned and could not have paid for. Pagans watched Christians die in the arena, and they asked each other what could possibly make a person face death with that kind of composure. And the answer to that question, when people began looking for it, was the faith itself. North Africa would produce in the 4th and 5th centuries another figure whose influence on the Western Church rivals Paul's, Augustine of Hippo. But Augustine's story is a later chapter. For now, it is enough to note that Carthage received the faith and transformed it into Latin, transformed it from a largely Greek-speaking movement into a movement that could address the western half of the empire in its own language, and through Latin eventually the barbarian kingdoms that would succeed Rome in Western Europe. The spread into Gaul and Britain and Spain was slower and less documented, but it was real. Lyon in Gaul had a Christian community by the 2nd century. We know because of the terrible persecution of 177 AD, in which the Bishop Pothinus died in prison and a young woman named Blandina was tortured and killed, her extraordinary endurance becoming one of the most celebrated accounts of martyrdom in the early church. The survivor of that persecution, Irenaeus, became Bishop of Lyon and wrote one of the most important theological works of the 2nd century, his Refutation of Gnosticism, which helped define what Orthodox Christianity believed against the most sophisticated of its internal alternatives. Britain, Christian communities appear there by the early 3rd century. Tertullian, writing in North Africa, could boast, with perhaps some rhetorical exaggeration, that all the limits of Spain and the diverse nations of Gaul and the haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. The faith had followed the Roman army and the Roman trade routes to the far northwest of the empire, to an island at the edge of the known world, and found purchase there too. How was all of this happening? What were the actual mechanisms? The first mechanism was the most ordinary. People moved, and they took their faith with them. The Roman Empire was, by ancient standards, an extraordinarily mobile world. Soldiers were stationed far from their homes of origin. Merchants travelled to new markets. Freed slaves made new lives in new cities. Jewish communities moved in response to political pressure or economic opportunity. And wherever people went, they carried their practices and their community with them. A woman from Antioch who followed her husband to Rome brought the practice of Sunday worship and the stories of Jesus. A craftsman from Alexandria who moved to Carthage brought the habit of gathering in houses for prayer and teaching. The faith spread at the speed of human movement, which in the Roman world was faster than it would be for the next 1,000 years. The second mechanism was hospitality. The early Christian communities had a remarkable practice of receiving strangers. When a believer arrived in a new city, the local church was expected to welcome them, house them, feed them, and help them establish themselves. The letters of Paul are full of commendations. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Century. I ask you to receive her in the Lord, in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you. Phoebe is travelling to Rome with the letter. The Roman Church is expected to treat her as a sister. The Didact, an early church manual probably from the late 1st century, gives detailed instructions about how to receive travelling teachers and prophets. Welcome them, feed them, but be discerning about how long they stay and whether their lives match their teaching. This network of hospitality was the connective tissue of the expanding movement. Communities that had never met knew about each other because travellers had passed through. Letters circulated through the same network. The community in Philippi knew about the community in Corinth, not because anyone had briefed them, but because members of each had visited the other. The early church functioned like a single organism, spread across hundreds of cities, nourished by the circulation of people and letters. The third mechanism was the letters. Paul's letters were real correspondence, but they very quickly became something more. They were copied and shared. Communities that received one letter began to circulate it to neighbouring communities. By the end of the 1st century, collections of Paul's letters were being treated as authoritative in communities he had never visited, in places that would not have known him personally. The Gospels circulated in the same way. Composed in one community for their community's use, they were copied and copied again until every major centre had all four. The written word was the faith's long-distance ambassador. It could go where the body could not. Paul in prison in Rome could still, through a letter carried by Phoebe or Timothy or Epaphroditus, speak to the Philippians, the Corinthians, the Galatians. Peter, writing from Babylon, could address communities across the arc of Asia Minor. The community in one city could know what the community in another city believed, could learn from their mistakes and their triumphs, could feel connected to a body larger than any single local gathering. The fourth mechanism was harder to name, but perhaps the most powerful: the community itself. What the early church was offering was, in the context of the ancient world, genuinely unusual. Roman society was organised by hierarchy: the patron and the client, the master and the slave, the citizen and the non-citizen, the man and the woman. Social position determined everything: where you sat at dinner, who spoke first, whose testimony was admissible in court. The early Christian communities gathered people across these hierarchies and addressed each other as brothers and sisters. The meal they shared, the Lord's Supper, was notoriously egalitarian for its time, though the letters of Paul make clear that even this was contested, with wealthy members at Corinth eating separately from the poorer ones. But the aspiration was there, and it was distinctive. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That statement from Paul's letter to the Galatians was a theological claim, but it was also a social claim. And in communities that tried to live by it, it produced something that people from outside those communities noticed. When the philosopher Aristides wrote an apology for Christianity around 125 AD, he observed, "If there is among them a man that is poor and in need, and they have not an abundance of necessities, they fast 2 or 3 days that they may supply the needy with necessary food." The community cared for its own, and not only its own. During the plagues that swept through the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians gained a reputation for nursing the sick, including sick strangers, while others fled. Julian the Apostate, the 4th century emperor who tried to restore paganism, complained bitterly that the Galileans were caring for pagan poor, as well as their own, while the pagan temples did nothing of the sort. He was right, and it was an advantage he could not replicate by decree. What the early church was offering, underneath all the theology, was community, real community, across social barriers that the rest of the world maintained as permanent and natural. And in a world where most people were poor, most people were lonely, most people had no social safety net beyond their immediate family, a community that would care for you when you were sick and bury you when you died and remember your name after you were gone. This was not a small thing. This was something people would cross oceans for, and did. The martyrs were the 5th mechanism, and the most paradoxical. The Roman authorities hoped that public executions would deter people from joining the movement. Instead, they functioned as the movement's most powerful advertisement. The spectacle of men and women dying calmly, forgiving their torturers, praising God in the arena. This was not what Roman observers expected. Death was supposed to make people desperate and afraid. These people seemed, impossibly, to not be afraid. And the question of why they were not afraid was a question that led people directly to the faith's central claim, that death had been conquered, that Jesus had walked out of a sealed tomb, and that what had happened to him would happen to those who were in him. Tertullian was watching this happen and naming it. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Each execution produced witnesses, and the witnesses produced questioners, and the questioners became believers, and the believers became part of the community, and some of them would eventually become martyrs themselves. The Romans could not find a termination point for this loop. The more they suppressed, the more it spread. The account of Polycarp's martyrdom, written shortly after his death in approximately 155 AD, captures what a pagan observer watching a Christian execution might have seen. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, believed to have known the Apostle John personally, perhaps 86 years old when he died. Brought into the arena, told to deny Christ, he said, 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Set on fire, he prayed while the flames rose around him. The account describes the crowd watching in astonishment. Many of them had come to see an execution. What they saw was an old man dying as if he were going somewhere he had always wanted to go. The account of his death spread through the churches of Asia Minor and beyond. It was copied and shared as a template, not for death-seeking, but for the confidence in which one could face death. The Christian community was building a library of witness, a collection of examples of what the faith looked like under the most extreme pressure, and distributing them through its network as both encouragement and teaching. You could be like Polycarp. You could face the fire with that kind of composure. And if you found yourself asking what it would take to be able to do that, you were already asking the question that the faith was waiting to answer. Armenia tells a different kind of story, not of gradual spread through networks, but of dramatic transformation through a single, extraordinary sequence of events. The Armenian kingdom sat at the northeastern corner of the Roman world, on the border between the Roman and Parthian empires, a buffer state that spent much of its history being pulled between the two great powers. It had its own language, its own culture, its own religious traditions, the worship of the Armenian national gods, Aramazd and Anahit and Vahang. And then, at the very beginning of the 4th century, something happened that changed it entirely. The story begins with a man named Gregory, born into an Armenian noble family with connections to the Parthian royal line, who converted to Christianity and was brought to Armenia to preach. King Tiridates, the third of Armenia, had Gregory imprisoned for his faith, thrown into a pit called the Kor Virap, where the condemned were expected to die. He survived for years. Meanwhile, the king was afflicted with a mental illness that the sources describe as causing him to behave like a wild boar, running in the fields, eating grass, his mind gone. His sister had a dream instructing her to release Gregory to heal him. They pulled Gregory out of the pit after 13 years. He prayed for the king. The king's mind was restored. Tiridates converted, and then he made Christianity the official religion of his kingdom. In 301 AD, more than a decade before Constantine's Edict of Milan would make it legal in the Roman Empire. Armenia was the first kingdom in history to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. Gregory the Illuminator, as he was thereafter known, became the first Catholicos of the Armenian Church, and the church he founded has maintained unbroken continuity for 17 centuries. The consequences of Armenia's conversion were far-reaching. The Armenian Church, to make Christianity accessible to the entire population, needed scripture in the Armenian language. An alphabet was invented, the Armenian alphabet, created specifically for the purpose of translating the Bible and the liturgy, one of the most beautiful writing systems in the world. The faith was not content to remain in Greek or Syriac. It grew its own linguistic tools in each new cultural context it entered. This is one of the most remarkable patterns of the early spread. The faith consistently translated itself. It did not require converts to learn a foreign language to access it. It went into the vernacular, produced indigenous scripture, created local theological vocabularies. This is the opposite of most imperial religions, which require submission to the empire's cultural forms. The faith that spread across the ancient world was doing something different. It was becoming Armenian in Armenia, Syriac in Syria, Egyptian in Egypt, Latin in the West, while claiming to be one faith, one body, one Lord. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is the moment when the publicly visible size of the movement becomes unmistakable. The Emperor Constantine had summoned bishops from across the entire church, from Britain to Persia, from Egypt to the Balkans, to settle the theological dispute about the nature of Christ that had been dividing communities for a decade. Approximately 300 bishops attended, representing communities from every corner of the empire and beyond. This was the church in full view for the first time, its geographic extent suddenly measurable, its diversity suddenly visible, its ability to assemble in council across political and cultural boundaries suddenly demonstrated. 3 centuries after the crucifixion, 3 centuries of movement by ship and by road, of conversations in marketplaces and synagogues, of letters passed hand to hand and read aloud in lamplight, of martyrs' accounts copied and circulated, of hospitality offered to strangers, of communities caring for the sick and burying the dead, of men and women translated from one life to another by an encounter with a story they could not dismiss, and a community they found they could not leave. The empire that had built the roads and the sea lanes, and that had tried more than once to stamp the movement out, was now convening its bishops in a council. 300 bishops from the edges of the known world meeting in Nicaea, a small city in Western Asia Minor, because the Emperor of Rome had invited them. The Emperor of Rome. Constantine had seen a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. He said afterward that he'd seen the Chi-Rho symbol, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, and had heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." He had his soldiers mark their shields with the symbol and won the battle. He became Emperor of the West and eventually of the whole empire, and he attributed his victories to the Christian God. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD, issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, granted religious freedom to all, ended the persecutions, and ordered the restitution of property taken from Christian communities. The church went from being intermittently illegal to being officially patronized in a generation. Constantine built basilicas, magnificent ones, over the sites of the apostles' tombs in Rome and over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He poured imperial resources into the church's infrastructure. He made Sunday a public holiday. He gave bishops legal authority in civil disputes between Christians. He convened the Council of Nicaea and presided over its opening session in his golden robes. What did this mean? It meant, on one level, that the faith had won. The empire that had crucified Jesus and beheaded Paul and crucified Peter upside down had decided to align itself with the thing it had been trying to destroy for 3 centuries. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of religion. What it also meant was that the relationship between the faith and power had changed in ways that would take centuries to work out, and that are still being worked out. The faith that had spread through the empire because it was small and vulnerable and cared for the weak was now the faith of the emperor, and emperors are not small and vulnerable. The faith that had distinguished itself by caring for the poor would now be administered by bishops who lived in palaces. The faith that had been planted by tent makers and cloth merchants would now be built into the architecture of empire. Some things were gained. The persecution ended. The communities could meet openly. The scriptures could be copied without fear. The bishops could travel to Nicaea and debate theology without fearing arrest. The Edict of Milan was, for people who had been hiding and hunted, an answer to prayers that had been uttered for 3 centuries. Some things were lost, or at least complicated. The community of the margins, the community that had been so attractive to people at the margins of Roman society precisely because it was a community of the margins, began to acquire the texture of the centre. The church that had survived by the faithfulness of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances became, in some measure, an institution with institutional interests, institutional politics, institutional power. This was not inevitable. The faith would again and again, across the following centuries, produce movements that remembered what it was before Constantine. But it was a real change and a real cost. But the spread. Let us stay with the spread, because by the time of Constantine's conversion, the geography of Christian presence was staggering. Communities in Britain, at the northwestern edge of the Roman world, in the damp and fog of an island, the Romans themselves had only partially subdued. Communities in Spain and Gaul, the western provinces. Communities in Rome and throughout Italy. Communities along the North African coast from Egypt to Carthage to Numidia. The Church of Alexandria, intellectually sophisticated and deeply embedded in the culture of the most educated city in the world. The Ethiopian Church, ancient and distinctive, with its own liturgy and its own practices, and its tradition reaching back to the road from Jerusalem to Gaza. The Syriac churches east of the empire, worshipping in the language Jesus spoke, communities in Persia, in Armenia, in Mesopotamia, and further east the seeds of what would become the Church of the East, moving along the Silk Road towards Central Asia and eventually to India and China. The Nestorian stele, erected in the Chinese city of Xi'an in 781 AD, 6 centuries after Nicaea, records in both Chinese and Syriac the arrival of Christianity in China during the Tang dynasty. It describes the faith as having arrived in China in 635 AD, carried by a monk named Alopen from the Church of the East. It praises the emperor for receiving the teaching. It describes the opening of a monastery in the capital. It is a remarkable document, a stone monument in the middle of China, documenting the presence of a faith that had begun beside the Sea of Galilee 600 years earlier. Beside the Sea of Galilee. 2 fishermen leaving their nets on a stony beach, a voice saying, "Follow me." And then 6 centuries later, a stone carved in Chinese and Syriac in the Tang dynasty capital, recording that the teaching had arrived. That is the arc of the Great Diaspora. That is the distance travelled by a story that began small and humble and insisted on travelling. What reached you tonight, wherever you are, whatever corner of the world received you and raised you, came along a chain that stretches back through every century between this one and the first, through people and languages and cultures you will never know by name, through trade routes and church councils and missionary journeys and plague outbreaks and persecutions and quiet households where people gathered before dawn to sing hymns and share bread. The faith that spread across the ancient world did not stop at the ancient world. It kept going. It is still going, and it arrived somehow at you at this moment, in whatever place in the world you are listening from tonight. If this story of the Great Diaspora has stirred something in you tonight, I would love to hear from you in the comments, where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. The fact that we can gather around these stories from such different places feels like its own small version of the ancient miracle we have been discussing. And if you would like to keep going on these journeys through the ancient world and the faith that crossed it, please consider subscribing so that the next story finds you when it comes. There will always be another story. There will always be another road and someone walking it, and something worth carrying. Rest well tonight. You are the most recent point on a very long line. The road behind you goes all the way back to a lake in Galilee, and the road ahead is still being walked. Sleep now. The journey continues in the morning. But the story of how Christianity spread is not only a story of geography, it is also a story of the people who carried it. And those people are worth spending time with, because they are not who you might expect. When we think of the spread of a faith or an ideology across history, we tend to think of it in terms of leaders, the general who conquers, the emperor who decrees, the charismatic founder who gathers followers. The spread of early Christianity was different. It was driven to a remarkable degree by people whose names we do not know, or barely know, people who appear in a single sentence of a letter and then disappear from the record, having carried something precious to a new place and left it there. Take the unnamed believers from Cyprus and Cyrene who went to Antioch and first spoke to Greeks. They appear in a single clause of Acts 11:20 and then are gone. We know their geographic origins, Cyprus and Cyrene, which tells us they were Diaspora Jews, people already comfortable in the Greek-speaking world. We know what they did. They began speaking to Greeks as well as Jews, crossing the ethnic boundary that the Jerusalem church had not yet crossed in its evangelism. We know the result. A great number believed and turned to the Lord. And then they vanished from the record, their names unknown, their subsequent lives unreported. But what they did in Antioch changed the direction of Christian history, because what they started in Antioch is what gave Paul his platform, and what gave Paul his platform is what planted communities across the Aegean world, and what was planted across the Aegean world eventually reached Rome, and from Rome it reached Europe, and from Europe it reached the Americas and Africa and Asia in the modern period. 2 or 3 unnamed men from Cyprus and Cyrene, speaking to Greeks in a city in Syria, set off a chain of consequence that is still running. Or consider Phoebe. She is mentioned in a single verse of Romans 16. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Century. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. Phoebe was a deacon, a recognised office of the church, in Century, the eastern port of Corinth. She was a benefactor, a patroness, a woman of sufficient means and social standing to provide material support to the community and to Paul himself. And she was the person carrying Paul's letter to Rome. The most important letter Paul ever wrote, the letter that would shape Augustine's theology, that would spark Luther's Reformation, that would define the doctrines of grace and justification across 20 centuries of Western Christianity, was delivered to Rome in the hands of a woman from the port town east of Corinth. Phoebe probably read it aloud to the gathered community, since that is what the carrier of a letter in the ancient world typically did. She was the first person in history to proclaim the text of Romans to a Christian community. She gets one verse, or consider the household of Stephanas, mentioned briefly in 1 Corinthians. The first converts in the region of Achaia, devoted to the service of the Lord's people. Or Epaphras, described as a faithful minister of Christ in Colossae, who apparently founded the churches in the Lycus Valley. Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, without Paul himself ever visiting. Or Demetrius, commended in 3 John. Or Gaius, who hosted the whole church in his city. Or Nympha, in whose house the Colossian community met. The spread of the faith was made possible by a network of such people. Hosts, deacons, patrons, letter carriers, founders of local communities, most of whom are known to us only by a name in a greeting or a passing reference in a travel account. The women in this network deserve particular attention because their role has often been underemphasized in later retellings of the story, even though the sources themselves do not underemphasize it. Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection. In all 4 Gospels, it is women who go to the tomb first, women who find it empty, women who encounter the risen Jesus. The legal tradition of the first century did not count women's testimony as admissible in court. The early church was founded on testimony that Roman law would not have accepted, and the church preserved and transmitted this testimony precisely because it was true, not because it was convenient. In Paul's letter to the Romans, 8 of the 26 people he greets are women: Phoebe, Prisca, Priscilla, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, and the mother of Rufus. Junia is described, as mentioned earlier, as outstanding among the apostles, a woman named among the apostles by the man who wrote more New Testament texts than anyone else. Tryphena and Tryphosa worked hard in the Lord. Persis worked very hard. Mary worked very hard for the church. These are not decorative references. They are recognitions of substantial contribution. Priscilla, always named with her husband Aquila, but often named first, which in the naming conventions of the time suggests she was the more prominent of the two, appears as a co-worker with Paul in Corinth, as the host of a church in her home in Ephesus, and as the host of a church in her home in Rome. She and Aquila risked their lives for Paul, he says. Exactly what that involved he does not specify, but it was enough to make him grateful. And when Apollos, a learned Jew from Alexandria, with an impressive knowledge of the scriptures, arrived in Ephesus preaching a baptism that was apparently incomplete, it was Priscilla and Aquila who took him aside and explained the way of God more adequately. A woman, Priscilla, instructing the eloquent Alexandrian scholar in correct doctrine. This is the early church. The house church was the basic unit of the early church's life, and houses in the ancient world were managed by women. The mater familias, the woman of the household, organised the domestic space, supervised the slaves who maintained it, managed the relationships with the clients and the neighbours and the suppliers. When a house church gathered in a wealthy patron's home, the woman of that home was typically the one making it possible. The hospitality network that sustained the spread of the faith, the practice of receiving travelling believers and providing them with food and shelter and connection to the local community, was, in large part, women's work in the most practical sense. Women managed the households that offered the hospitality. The evidence suggests that women played significant roles as leaders in the early communities, and that this became more constrained as the church institutionalized and began to align itself more closely with the hierarchical structures of the surrounding society. The letters of Paul contain both the radical theological affirmation, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, and the more restrictive practical instructions that appear in some of his letters about women's speech in assemblies, instructions that have been debated, contested, and differently interpreted across the centuries. What is clear is that the early spread of the faith included women as active agents of transmission, not merely passive recipients. The same is true of enslaved people. Slavery was one of the most fundamental institutions of the Roman world. Estimates suggest that slaves made up between 20 and 30% of the population of the empire. The early church included significant numbers of enslaved people from its beginning, and this had implications for the spread of the faith. Enslaved people moved when their owners moved or sold them. An enslaved person sold from one household to another carried their community and practice with them. The household of an enslaved Christian believer might include other enslaved people who were not yet believers and who lived in close enough proximity that the faith could spread. When an enslaved person was freed, and manumission was common enough in the Roman world to be a regular occurrence, but the freed person became a mobile carrier of whatever they had received in their previous situation. The practical effect was that the faith entered households through multiple points of entry simultaneously. A merchant husband might hear Paul preach at the synagogue. His wife might hear about the resurrection from the woman at the next stall in the market. Their household slaves might learn about it from another household slaves. The faith percolated through the social networks of the Roman world without requiring a coordinated strategy, because social networks were already doing what they always do, transmitting information and practice and community allegiance through the ordinary connections of daily life. And what about the content? What was it that actually convinced people? What did they hear when they heard the gospel that made them willing to risk social disapproval, legal jeopardy, and sometimes their lives to be part of the community? The earliest missionary preaching that we have recorded in the speeches of Acts and in the outline Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15 has a consistent shape. It begins with the story. Jesus of Nazareth, proclaimed in advance by the Jewish prophets, crucified, buried, raised, on the third day appearing to witnesses. It continues with the implication he is Lord and Messiah, and the response required is repentance and faith and baptism. And it concludes with the promise, forgiveness of sins, the gift of the Holy Spirit, the hope of resurrection. This is a very compact message. What made it convincing? Part of the answer is surely the community. People heard the message and then they saw the community. And what they saw in the community was something they wanted. The mutual aid, the boundary-crossing fellowship, the care for the weak, the dignifying of the lowly. In a world stratified by birth and wealth and ethnicity, a community that genuinely crossed those lines was remarkable. People joined it not only because of what they heard, but because of what they experienced when they came near it. Part of the answer is the resurrection. The claim was not vague, it was historical. Jesus of Nazareth, executed under Pontius Pilate, was seen alive by specific people in specific places within days of his execution. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 is extraordinary in its specificity. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, Paul adds, though some have fallen asleep. Then to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, to Paul himself. This is the argument of a man who is inviting his readers to go check. Most of the witnesses are still alive. Ask them. The resurrection, if true, changes everything. It means that death is not the last word. It means that the power that took Jesus into the tomb could not hold him there. It means that the suffering of the martyrs, the suffering of every person who ever lived and died and was afraid of dying, is addressed at its root by something that has actually happened. The early church did not preach a philosophy about how to accept death gracefully. It preached the claim that a specific man had not merely accepted death, but walked out of it, and was inviting everyone else to follow. If that is true, it is not a minor piece of information. It is the most important thing that has ever happened. Part of the answer for those with intellectual inclinations was the coherence of the story. The claim that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, that the whole arc of the Old Testament had been pointing toward this moment, gave the gospel a depth that made it worth spending a lifetime studying. The law and the prophets and the writings, all of it reread through the lens of the resurrection, all of it yielding new meaning, all of it becoming more interesting rather than less. Origen could spend his entire adult life thinking about the relationship between the scriptures and the person of Christ and never exhaust it. The faith was intellectually generative in a way that could satisfy the most demanding minds. And part of the answer for many people in many places was simply that they encountered something real when they prayed. The accounts of healing in the Gospels, in Acts, in the letters, in the accounts of the early church historians are too numerous and too consistent to be entirely discounted. People who prayed in the name of Jesus reported that things happened. People who were suffering were comforted. People who were afraid found courage. People who had no reason for hope found that they had hope anyway. Whether one explains this in naturalistic or supernatural terms, the experiential dimension of early Christian faith was real. and it was a real part of why people joined and stayed. The question of theological controversy is also part of the story, not as a distraction from the spread, but as a driver of it. The early church was not a monolith. It was a collection of diverse communities across diverse cultures, working out the implications of the same core claims in very different contexts. And the process of working this out, through councils and letters and debates and creeds, was itself a mechanism of communication and connection. The Nicene Creed, produced at the Council of 325, was sent back to every community whose bishop had attended. The theological debates of the 2nd century, about the nature of Jesus, about the authority of Scripture, about the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, generated an enormous literary output that travelled through the networks of the Church. Irenaeus in Lyon was responding to Valentinus in Rome and Marcion's teachings that had spread across the Aegean. The controversy spread the conversation, and the conversation spread the faith. Marcion is worth a moment. He was a wealthy shipowner from Pontus, the northern coast of Asia Minor, who came to Rome around 140 AD with his own understanding of the Christian message. He believed that the God of the Old Testament was a different, inferior God from the Father whom Jesus revealed. He rejected the entire Old Testament and produced his own reduced canon of Scripture, only a modified version of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. He was expelled from the Roman Church and founded his own community, which spread rapidly across the empire and lasted for centuries. What Marcion's movement provoked was the Church's articulation of what it did believe. The Marcionite challenge, which scriptures do we accept and on what basis, forced the communities to think carefully about the question they had not needed to answer before someone forced it. The result, over time, was the canon of Scripture, the agreed list of authoritative texts, and the canon, once established, became one of the most powerful tools of coherence the Church possessed. Every community, wherever it was, could know that it was reading the same texts, could know what the foundation documents of the faith said, could measure any new teaching against what the apostles had written. The 2nd century was also the period of the great apologists, thinkers who wrote defences of Christianity addressed to the Roman emperor or to educated pagan audiences. Justin Martyr, writing in Rome in the mid-2nd century, was the most influential. He was a philosopher before he became a Christian, trained in Platonic philosophy, and his defence of Christianity was addressed explicitly to the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and argued that Christian teaching was more rational than the myths of the traditional gods. He coined the concept of the logos spermatikos, the seed of the word, the idea that the divine logos, reason, word, that Christians identify with Christ had been partially at work in every human being and in every tradition of genuine truth-seeking. Greek philosophy had been reaching toward what Christian revelation had now disclosed. This was an ambitious and generous way of understanding the relationship between Christianity and the wisdom of other traditions, and it gave the faith an intellectual confidence, a willingness to engage with the best thinking of its context rather than simply dismissing it, that would serve it well in the centuries of expansion to come. Justin died as a martyr, which is how he got the name, around 165 AD, executed for his faith in Rome. His apologies survived. His method of engaging Greek philosophy with Christian theology was carried forward by Clement of Alexandria, and Origen and Tertullian, and eventually into the systematic theology of the patristic tradition. The faith did not spread only through emotional experience and communal care. It spread also through the force of argument, through the willingness to engage the hardest questions and the best available intellectual tools. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is sometimes treated as a kind of endpoint, the moment when Christianity had established enough institutional coherence to define its own identity formally and permanently. In fact, it was more like a pause in a much longer story. The creed produced at Nicaea defined the relationship between the Father and the Son, of the same substance, the Greek word homoousios, but it did not settle all the questions that the theology of the Incarnation raises. The debates continued about the humanity of Jesus, about the relationship between his human and divine natures, about the status of Mary. Each new debate produced a council, and each council produced a statement, and each statement circulated through the networks of the Church, and the circulation of the statement carried information about the Church's geography and the diversity of its contexts, along with the theological content. But there is a tendency, in telling the story of the early Church's spread, to end with Constantine and Nicaea, as if that were the destination, as if the faith had been trying to get to imperial patronage and finally made it. This misses something important. The communities that survived persecution and spread through the empire and produced the martyrs and the apologists and the theologians did not think they were trying to become the empire's religion. They were trying to be faithful to a resurrection. They were trying to live in a way that reflected the claim that death had been defeated. They were trying to be a community that showed the world what it looked like when human beings treated each other as sisters and brothers, regardless of social category. They were trying, in short, to be what Peter's letter called them, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, not because they had conquered or because they had been officially recognized, but because they had been called. When Constantine's patronage came, it came as a surprise, a gift that was also a test, a change that would require enormous wisdom to navigate well, and which the Church did not always navigate well. But the faith that received the patronage was not the faith that needed the patronage. It had already done the extraordinary thing. It had spread from Jerusalem to Britain, from the Mediterranean to India, from the Roman provinces to the kingdoms beyond them, in 3 centuries, without armies, without emperors, without coercion. It had done this on the strength of a story, and a community, and a hope that death is not the end. Let us end where we began, with the question of how. How did a faith that began with a handful of frightened people in an upper room in Jerusalem reach the ends of the ancient world in 3 centuries? It travelled along the roads the empire had built, and along the sea lanes the empire had secured. It travelled in the bodies of merchants and craftspeople, and soldiers and slaves, and freed people who took it wherever they went. It travelled in letters that were copied and shared and read aloud in communities that then made their own copies and sent them on. It travelled through the hospitality of households that opened themselves to strangers who shared their faith. It travelled in the spectacular courage of people dying calmly in arenas and asking God to forgive the people who were killing them. It travelled through the care that communities showed for the sick and the poor, including those outside the community. It travelled through the intellectual engagement of thinkers who took seriously both the claims of the faith and the best wisdom of their context. It travelled through the translations into Greek and Latin and Syriac and Armenian and Coptic and Ge'ez, and eventually every language that would receive it, because the faith insisted on speaking to people in their own tongue. And at the root of all of this, underneath every mechanism and every person and every road and every letter, was the claim that something had happened. A specific claim made by specific people about a specific event, that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified under Pontius Pilate and had been raised from the dead on the third day. The mechanisms of spread were remarkable, but they were in service of this claim. The community was remarkable, but the community existed because of this claim. The martyrs were remarkable, but they faced death with composure because of this claim. The missionaries were remarkable, but they travelled because of this claim. If the claim was true, then everything the movement did in spreading it was not only understandable, but necessary. If the most important thing that had ever happened in human history had just happened, and you knew about it, the only adequate response was to go tell everyone, by whatever means, and to whatever distance your life permitted. That is what they did. And the reach of what they did is visible tonight in the fact that wherever you are listening from, in whatever country, on whatever continent, in whatever tradition of faith or no faith that shapes the world you were raised in, the story we have been telling tonight has touched the place where you are. The ancient world reached this far. The road from Jerusalem, travelled by tent makers and cloth merchants and deacons and women with scrolls, and old men walking to their executions, eventually arrived at this moment, at this night, at wherever you are. The story of the great Diaspora is not over. It never reaches an end. Every generation that receives it becomes part of the chain of transmission, carries it forward in whatever way their life and gifts permit, and leaves it to the next. You are the most recent link. What you do with it next is the story still being written. I hope tonight's journey through the ancient world, from the shores of Galilee to the roads of the Roman Empire, to the catechetical schools of Alexandria, to the pits of Khor Virap in Armenia, has been one worth taking. If it has, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where you are, what time it is, what part of the story most caught your imagination. And if you would like to continue travelling through these ancient landscapes and the people who populated them, please subscribe so that the next story finds you. There is always another road. There is always another person worth knowing. There is always another chapter of the longest story ever told. Go gently into the night. Rest well. The world was changed by ordinary people who could not stop sharing what they had found, and whatever they found is still here, still available, still, for anyone who wants it, inexhaustible. Sleep now. There is a geography to the early church's expansion that becomes visible when you draw it on a map, and the shape of that geography is instructive. The faith did not move in concentric circles outward from Jerusalem, the way ripples move from a stone dropped in still water. It moved along lines, the lines of roads, the lines of sea routes, the lines of trade networks, the lines of ethnic community. It jumped from city to city, skipping the countryside in between, establishing itself in nodes and then radiating outward from each node into the surrounding region. This is the pattern Paul was following instinctively when he targeted provincial capitals and major commercial cities. Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Antioch. These were not chosen for their spiritual significance, but for their strategic position in the networks of the ancient world. A community established in Ephesus could spread to the smaller cities of the Lycus Valley, Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, through the commercial and personal connections that ran between the provincial capital and its dependent towns. A community established in Thessalonica, the capital of Macedonia, could spread along the Egnatian Way to both east and west. A community established in Corinth, at the crossroads of the Aegean and Adriatic sea routes, could spread with every ship that departed from its harbours. Paul says somewhere that he has always wanted to go where Christ has not yet been named, rather than building on someone else's foundation. This was both a personal commitment and a strategic orientation. He was not trying to consolidate what already existed. He was trying to establish new nodes, new centres from which the faith could then spread without him. The communities he founded were not dependent on him for their continued existence. He left them, sometimes abruptly, and expected them to continue. Some of them managed this better than others. Corinth was a particular challenge, but the design was one of self-replicating communities rather than a hierarchy dependent on the founder's presence. The community of Philippi is the most vivid example of what Paul was aiming at. He founded it on his second journey, in circumstances of considerable drama: the earthquake, the jailer, the midnight baptism. He left it relatively quickly. He was never able to return as often as he wanted, and yet the Philippian community became one of the most faithful and generous in his entire network. They sent money to him in prison. They sent Epaphroditus to help him. They prayed for him. They reproduced themselves without instruction. And when Paul writes to them from prison, the letter he sends is the warmest and most personally affectionate thing he wrote. My joy and crown, he calls them. The community had become what he had hoped for, not a branch office of the Antioch church or the Jerusalem church or the Paul organization, but its own living thing, capable of generating its own joy and sustaining its own faithfulness. This pattern of self-replicating communities is part of what made the faith so hard to suppress. When Rome arrested Paul, the communities he had planted continued. When Rome killed Peter, the community in Rome continued. When Rome killed the leaders, the communities survived because the leaders had built them to survive without the leaders. The faith had been distributed, not centralized. It was resilient in the way that distributed networks are resilient. You cannot destroy it by striking the head, because the head is everywhere. The relationship between the early church and the Roman state is a more complicated story than the simple narrative of persecution and survival suggests. In the first century, Rome was not entirely sure what Christians were. They were initially confused with Jews, and Jews had a recognized legal status in the empire. They were permitted to practice their ancestral religion, to maintain their synagogues, to be exempt from certain religious requirements, like sacrificing to the emperor, that the empire imposed on others. The early Christian communities, which emerged from Jewish contexts and used Jewish scriptures and maintained many Jewish practices, were sometimes sheltered by this ambiguity. When the distinction between Jewish believers and Gentile Christians became clearer, which it did increasingly, as the Gentile mission grew, the Christians lost the shelter of the Jewish exemption. They were now a new thing, without a recognized legal status, practicing a religion that Rome did not know how to categorize. The Roman legal system was not designed for universal religious suppression. It was designed for the maintenance of order and the management of relationships between recognized social categories. Christians fell between the categories. The result was a patchwork of persecution, intense in some places and times, minimal in others, driven by local conditions and local governors rather than by consistent imperial policy. The Neronian persecution of 64 AD was real and terrible, but it was confined to the city of Rome and may have been specifically tied to the fire rather than to any general anti-Christian policy. Pliny the Younger in Bithynia was writing to Trajan around 112 AD because he was unsure what the policy was, which implies that there was no settled policy for him to apply. Trajan's answer was that Christians should not be actively hunted, but if brought before the authorities and convicted, they should be punished. A response that satisfied no one theoretically, but reflected the practical reality of an empire that was not primarily interested in religious uniformity. The Decian persecution of 250 AD was the first empire-wide attempt at systematic suppression. The Emperor Decius required all inhabitants of the empire to perform a sacrifice to the traditional gods and obtain a certificate proving they had done so. For most people, this was a routine religious act without particular significance. For Christians, it was a direct demand to deny the faith. The persecution produced a significant number of apostates, the lapsed as they were called, and a significant number of martyrs, and a significant number of people who found middle paths, bribing officials for certificates, obtaining certificates from sympathetic officials without actually sacrificing. It also produced an intense theological debate about what to do with the lapsed when the persecution ended. Should they be readmitted to the community, and on what terms? This debate, the Decian controversy, had consequences for the Church's development as an institution. The Bishop of Carthage, Cyprian, argued for a formal process of readmission, with periods of penance and public restoration. His argument implied a role for the episcopal hierarchy, the bishops, in managing the process of forgiveness and restoration. His opponents argued that forgiveness could be granted more directly, without episcopal mediation. The controversy shaped the theology of penance and the authority of the bishop in ways that would persist for centuries. Even persecution, even the crisis of the lapsed, became material for the Church's theological and institutional development. The Diocletianic persecution of 303 to 311 AD was the most severe and the last. Diocletian, attempting to consolidate and stabilize an empire that had been in chronic crisis for 50 years, identified the Christians as a destabilizing element and launched a systematic campaign of destruction. Christian scriptures were to be burned, churches demolished, clergy imprisoned, all believers required to sacrifice. The violence was real and widespread. Christians were killed in significant numbers across the empire. Churches were destroyed. Libraries of scripture were burned. But the faith did not disappear. The communities survived underground, maintained by the networks of hospitality and communication that had sustained them for 3 centuries. And when the persecution ended, terminated by Galerius's Edict of Toleration in 311, followed by Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313, the communities emerged intact. Constantine is a figure whose legacy in the Christian story is irreducibly complex. He converted, or at least committed himself to the Christian God, before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, attributing his subsequent victories to the God he had identified with the Chi-Rho symbol seen in his vision. Whether his conversion was genuine in the deepest sense, or whether it was more a political calculation, or whether the two things were genuinely inseparable in his own mind. Historians have argued about this for centuries, and will continue to argue. What is clear is that the practical consequences of his alignment with Christianity were enormous. The Edict of Milan was promulgated jointly by Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius in 313, and it granted toleration to all religions in the empire, specifically including Christianity, and ordered the restitution of property confiscated from Christian communities during the persecutions. It did not make Christianity the official state religion. That would come later under Theodosius in 380, but it ended the persecutions, allowed the church to own property legally, and gave bishops legal standing. It was for communities that had been gathering in private houses and catacombs, and had been watching their leaders killed and their scriptures burned, an extraordinary reversal. Constantine followed the edict with patronage. He built basilicas, the architectural form of the Roman law court, a large rectangular hall suitable for large gatherings, in the major Christian cities. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, given to the Bishop of Rome, as his cathedral, the basilica over the tomb of Peter on the Vatican Hill, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem over the site of the crucifixion and resurrection, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. He poured imperial resources into these buildings, making them magnificent in a way that matched or exceeded the great pagan temples. The visual message was clear. The faith that had met in private houses and rented halls was now a public institution with imperial architecture. He also convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, providing imperial resources and prestige to a gathering of bishops that the Church could not have organised on its own. The council addressed the Arian controversy, the question of whether the Son was fully equal to the Father in nature, or a superior creature, and produced the Nicene Creed, which affirmed that the Son was of the same substance as the Father. The creed was sent back to every community in the empire, communicated through the same networks that had distributed Paul's letters and the Gospels, and became the standard of orthodox belief against which subsequent theological proposals would be measured. Eusebius of Caesarea, who attended the Council of Nicaea and wrote the first comprehensive history of the Church, saw in Constantine's conversion the providential culmination of the faith's long expansion. In his ecclesiastical history, he traced the spread of the Church from Jerusalem through all the regions of the empire, documenting its growth with a kind of triumphalist joy. He was perhaps too optimistic. The history he was celebrating was more complicated and more costly than his narrative acknowledged, but his instinct to narrate the spread as a coherent story, with a direction and a shape, was not wrong. Something had happened. Something extraordinary had happened. And the question of how it had happened, by what mechanisms, through what people, along what roads, is the question we have been asking tonight. The Nestorian stele of Xi'an deserves more time because it represents something almost impossible to adequately convey. The year is 781 AD. The location is the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, the largest city in the world at that time, a magnificent metropolis of perhaps 1 million people at the centre of the most sophisticated civilization on earth. A stone monument is erected, the stele, carved in both Chinese and Syriac. It is approximately 10 feet tall. Its top is carved with a cross above clouds, the clouds above a lotus flower, a meeting of Christian and Chinese Buddhist imagery that captures perfectly the process of translation and synthesis that the faith had always performed. The text records the arrival of Christianity in China in 635 AD, the arrival of the monk Alopen from the west, bringing true scriptures to the Tang court. It describes the Emperor Taizong receiving Alopen with honour, inviting the scriptures to be translated, authorising the faith to spread, funding a monastery in the capital. The stele was buried, perhaps to protect it during a later period of anti-Christian repression. It was rediscovered in 1625. When Jesuit missionaries first saw it, they recognised the cross and the Syriac text and understood what they were looking at. Evidence that Christianity had reached China 1,000 years before they had. The Christian communities that the Nestorian missionaries had established in Tang dynasty China did not survive the subsequent political changes. They were suppressed in 845 AD, along with other foreign religions, in a wave of imperial nativism. But they had been there. The faith that began in Galilee had reached China. Along what road? Along the Silk Road, the great overland trade route connecting the Mediterranean world to Central Asia and China, running through Mesopotamia, through Persia, through the oases of Central Asia, through the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of the Tarim Basin, arriving eventually at Chang'an. The road that silk travelled west also carried Christian missionaries east. The Church of the East, the Syriac Christian tradition that had developed east of the Roman world, followed the Silk Road into Persia, into Central Asia, into India, and eventually into China, establishing communities at each significant stopping point along the way. At the height of its expansion, the Church of the East had metropolitanates, regional headquarters in Persia, in India, in China, in Central Asia. It had churches in places that Western Christianity would not reach for another 5 or 6 centuries. Its bishops gathered in synods in Mesopotamia and decided matters of theology and practice for communities stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And almost none of this is known to most Christians today, because the communities it established were eventually suppressed or absorbed, and because the Western Church lost contact with them and lost the memory of their existence. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, the Nasrani community, are the most visible survivors of this eastern expansion. When the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama arrived on the Malabar coast of India in 1498, he found Christians. They were using Syriac in their liturgy, following practices of the Church of the East and claiming Origen from the Apostle Thomas. The Portuguese were simultaneously amazed and troubled. Amazed because Christians already existed here, troubled because the Christians they found did not look like the Catholics they were expecting. There were disputes and conflicts, and the Nasrani community eventually split under Portuguese pressure. But they survived, and they are still there. A Christian community in Kerala with a continuous tradition going back, in their telling, to the apostle who put his finger in the wounds of the risen Christ and said, "My Lord and my God." The Ethiopian church has a similar story of survival through extraordinary circumstances. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the church that traces its origins to the Ethiopian eunuch on the road from Jerusalem, has maintained continuous existence for nearly 2,000 years. Through Muslim invasions, through the isolation that cut it off from the rest of the Christian world, for centuries, through the Marxist regime of the 20th century that tried to suppress it. Its liturgical language, Ge'ez, is a language that no longer exists as a spoken tongue, but is maintained in the Church's worship, the way Latin was maintained in the Roman Catholic liturgy. Its distinctive practices, the Tabot, the Saturday Sabbath, the particular arrangement of the church building, preserve elements of a very early Christian tradition before the developments of the later councils had homogenized practice across the Mediterranean world. It is, in a real sense, a window into what early Christianity looks like before it had been fully organized and systematized. The Armenian church, which we have already encountered, survived the catastrophes of the 20th century, including the genocide of 1915, in which the Ottoman Empire attempted to destroy the Armenian people, killing over 1 million people and driving the remainder into exile. The church survived the genocide as it had survived every previous persecution, by maintaining the community, the liturgy, the language, the memory. The faith that Gregory the Illuminator had brought to King Tiridates in 301 AD is still practiced by Armenians today, in Armenia and in diaspora communities around the world. The liturgy still in classical Armenian, the tradition still identifying itself as the continuation of what Gregory established. Survival. This is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of the ancient church's story. Not just the expansion, but the survival. Communities that were planted in the 1st and 2nd centuries persisted through persecutions and political changes and the collapse of the empires around them, and continued into the present. The faith proved more durable than the structures that tried to contain or destroy it. And the faith also proved more durable than the structures that tried to patronize it, because the communities that survived persecution also survived imperial favor, though imperial favor brought its own dangers. The Christianity that Constantine patronized in 313 was not the same Christianity that emerged from 3 centuries of persecution. It was more institutionalized, more hierarchically organized, more aligned with the structures of power. But the communities at the base, the house churches, the local gatherings, the networks of mutual aid and prayer and shared memory, continued. The institutional church and the grassroots community coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony, through all the centuries that followed. And through all of those centuries and in all of those places, the same core things persisted. The weekly gathering on the day of resurrection, the reading of the scriptures, the sharing of bread and wine, the practice of baptism, the prayer for one another and for the world, the care for the sick and the poor, the memory of the martyrs, the hope of resurrection. These practices, carried from community to community across the ancient world and across the centuries, are what we mean when we say that the faith spread, not an idea, not a doctrine, but a set of practices and relationships and stories that people received and maintained and passed on, that proved capable of being translated into every language and culture without losing what they essentially were. The faith that travelled along the Roman roads and the Silk Road and the sea lanes of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean was the same faith that travelled in the hearts of enslaved people across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships. The same faith that travelled with the missionaries to the Pacific Islands and to sub-Saharan Africa and to the remote valleys of South America. The same faith that is, right now, the fastest growing religious tradition in sub-Saharan Africa and in China and in Iran. The great diaspora did not end in the ancient world. It continues, and it arrived by whatever chain of transmission at whoever you are tonight. The road from Jerusalem that we've been walking for the past several hours eventually reached the place you are in. Somewhere in the chain between a prayer meeting by a river outside Philippi and a chariot conversation on a desert road from Jerusalem to Gaza, and a midnight earthquake in a Roman prison, and an old man dying in an arena in Smyrna, and a monk arriving at the Tang dynasty court with scriptures, somewhere in that long chain, the story found you. That is the great diaspora. That is how far a story can travel, when the people who hold it cannot stop sharing it. I am grateful that you travelled with me through this story tonight. As always, I would love to hear where you are listening from, the country, the city, the time of night or day. Leave it in the comments when you have a moment, or just let yourself drift off now into the quiet. Either is welcome. If this kind of journey through the ancient world is one you want to continue, please subscribe so that you're here for the next one. There are many more roads to walk, many more people worth knowing, many more chapters in the longest story ever told. And now, as the words slow and the night deepens around you, let me leave you with this: the same God who opened a road from Jerusalem to the ends of the ancient world is present in whatever road you are on tonight. The faith that travelled from a fishing village in Galilee to the Tang dynasty capital of China did not do so because of military force or political coercion. It did so because the people who carried it had found something worth carrying, and they could not stop. Whatever you carry, wherever you go, however far the road leads, rest well tonight. The story continues in you. There is one more dimension of the spread. that deserves its own account, because it is the dimension that most shaped how ordinary people experienced the faith in each new place it arrived. This is the dimension of translation, not just linguistic translation, but cultural translation, the process by which a faith rooted in a specific time and place and language became capable of living in every time and place, and language it entered. The first translation was the most consequential. The Hebrew scriptures, the Torah and the prophets, and the writings were translated into Greek in Alexandria several centuries before Jesus was born, in a process whose legend attributes it to 72 scholars working independently and arriving at identical translations. The Septuagint, as this Greek translation is called, is the version of the scriptures that most of the New Testament quotes. It is the version Paul read and argued from. When he stood in the synagogue at Pisidian Antioch and reasoned from the scriptures that the Messiah had to suffer and rise, he was reasoning from a Greek text, addressing a Greek-speaking audience, using a translation made centuries earlier by Jewish scholars in Egypt, who could not have imagined this purpose. The translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek made it possible for the Jewish tradition to be intellectually and spiritually accessible to the entire Greek-speaking world. The Septuagint is one of the reasons the Jewish diaspora was able to maintain a coherent identity across so many different cultural contexts. And it is the reason the early Christian missionaries, who drew so heavily on the Jewish scriptures in their preaching, were able to make their case to Greek-speaking audiences who had no Hebrew. The translation of the New Testament came next. The Gospels and Paul's letters were written in Greek, but within decades they were being translated into other languages as the faith moved beyond the Greek-speaking world, into Syriac, the Eastern Aramaic language of the communities around Edessa, which produced its own translation, called the Peshitta, still used in Syriac Christian liturgy today, into Coptic, the Egyptian language, written in an alphabet derived from Greek, in which the Alexandrian Church produced translations that gave ordinary Egyptians access to the scriptures in their own tongue. Into Latin, the language of the Western Empire, in which the old Latin translations were eventually revised and standardized by Jerome in the late 4th century, into the Vulgate, the translation that would be the Bible of Western Christianity for 1,000 years. Into Armenian, the alphabet invented specifically for the purpose of translating scripture into the language of a people who had become Christian and needed their own version, into Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian church, in which the Bible was translated and which preserved the faith through centuries of isolation. Into Gothic, the language of the Germanic Goths, into which the bishop Ulfilas translated the scriptures in the 4th century, inventing a Gothic alphabet for the purpose, and carrying the faith to the Germanic peoples beyond the empire's frontiers. Each translation required the translator to make hundreds of choices: how to render a word for which the target language had no equivalent, how to explain a concept rooted in one culture's specific practices to speakers of a completely different culture, how to maintain the authority and gravitas of the original while making it accessible to ordinary people in the new language. These were not merely linguistic challenges, they were theological and cultural challenges, and the people who undertook them were doing something that most religious traditions of the ancient world did not do. They were deciding that the faith had to be accessible to everyone in their own language, not just to those who could learn the original sacred tongue. This commitment to translation, to putting the scriptures and the liturgy into the vernacular, is one of the most distinctive features of early Christianity's expansion, and it is one of the reasons the expansion was so successful. Islam, in its early centuries, maintained that the Quran could only be fully understood in Arabic. Translations were permissible, but were not the Quran itself, and the religion retained a strong orientation toward Arabic as the sacred language. Early Christianity had no such attachment. Greek was the language of the New Testament, but Greek was not sacred in itself. The content could move into another language without losing what it essentially was. This conviction, which was not always held without controversy, but was consistently acted upon, meant that the faith could become genuinely local in every new context it entered. The process of localization went beyond language. When Christianity entered a new culture, it brought the core story and the core practices, the baptism, the shared meal, the scriptures, the resurrection proclamation, but it absorbed local patterns of music, local architectural forms, local aesthetic sensibilities, local philosophical frameworks. The church in Egypt developed the practice of monasticism, the withdrawal to the desert for prayer and ascetic discipline, drawing on Egyptian traditions of religious retreat that predated Christianity. The church in Gaul absorbed elements of Celtic religious practice. The church in Armenia incorporated elements of Armenian aesthetic tradition into its architecture and its liturgical art. The church in China, as the Nestorian stele shows us, drew on Buddhist and Taoist imagery to make the faith visually accessible to Chinese observers. This process of absorption and synthesis was not without its dangers. The church had to constantly negotiate between what was genuinely local expression and what was a compromise of the core content. The debates about this never ended, and they produced both great theological creativity and sometimes significant distortion. But the general orientation was toward translation and localization rather than toward the imposition of a single cultural form. And this orientation is part of why the faith could take root in so many different soils. The monasticism that Egypt gave to the church deserves particular attention, because it became one of the most important movements in the subsequent expansion of Christianity in Western Europe. The Desert Fathers, men like Antony and Pachomius and Macarius, who withdrew to the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries to live lives of radical prayer and simplicity, attracted followers who built communities around them, and those communities developed rules of life and practices of communal prayer that became the template for the monastic tradition. John Cassian carried the Egyptian monastic tradition to Gaul in the early 5th century. Benedict of Nursia, in the 6th century, composed a rule for monasteries in Italy that would become the foundation of Western monasticism. The monasteries that spread across Western Europe in the following centuries became the centres of literacy, agriculture, medicine, hospitality, and theological learning in a world that was collapsing around them as the Roman Empire disintegrated. They were, among other things, the vehicles by which the faith survived the fall of Rome and continued into the medieval world. The fall of Rome. This belongs in the story because it is the moment when the faith's resilience was tested most severely in the West. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, overrun by Germanic peoples, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, Ostrogoths, who had been pressing against the frontiers for generations. The city of Rome was sacked in 410 AD by the Visigoths, an event that shocked the ancient world. The great infrastructure that had made the faith's initial spread possible, the roads, the sea lanes, the common languages, the Pax Romana, was dismantling itself. Trade routes collapsed, cities shrank, literacy declined. The network of communication that had bound the communities together began to fray, and yet the faith survived. It survived because it had done what Paul had tried to design his communities to do. It had distributed itself widely enough and deeply enough in local communities that the collapse of the imperial infrastructure did not destroy it. The bishop of a small city in Gaul or Spain or North Africa did not depend on Rome to maintain his community's existence. The community had its own practices, its own scriptures in its own language, its own memory, its own leadership. When the imperial structures fell away, the church was still there, smaller in some places, challenged in others, occasionally overrun by the very paganism it had been replacing, but fundamentally surviving. Augustine of Hippo is the theologian of this moment. He was born in North Africa in 354, converted in Milan in 386, and became bishop of the North African city of Hippo in 395, where he served until his death in 430, the year the Vandals were besieging his city. He died while the barbarians were at the gates, and his community read his letter, asking them to mourn not the fall of cities, but the death of souls. He had already written his great response to the sack of Rome, The City of God, 22 books arguing that the Christian hope was never invested in the survival of any earthly city, including Rome, and that the city of God would outlast every human empire. Augustine read Paul's letter to the Romans with the intensity of someone for whom every word was addressed personally. His theology of grace, that human beings cannot save themselves, that God's love must take the initiative, that the gift is entirely gift and not reward for virtue, was Paul's theology of grace worked out in the context of a 5th century Western church that had been softening the point. He recovered the radicalism of Paul's insight and gave it to the Western theological tradition in a form it has never fully escaped or abandoned. When Luther in the 16th century returned to Paul's letter to the Romans and rediscovered justification by faith, he was in some measure returning to Augustine. When Calvin developed the doctrine of divine sovereignty and election, he was in some measure returning to Augustine. The fisherman's friend from Tarsus, writing to a community in Rome he had never visited, created, through that letter, a chain of theological influence that runs from Paul through Augustine, through Luther, through Calvin, through the entire Protestant tradition, and through the Catholic tradition that responded to it. That is the depth of the shadow that the ancient spread cast. Not only the spread itself, but the texts that the spreading produced, the letters and the Gospels, and the apologies, and the theological works, which were themselves carried along the same networks and continue to do their work long after the people who wrote them were dead. There is something remarkable about the way the early church talked about death and what lay beyond it, not because they were morbid or because death was the centre of their attention, but because their relationship to death was the thing that most distinguished them from their contemporaries and most enabled the spread. The Roman world had no reliable hope beyond death. The traditional myths had a variety of afterlife scenarios, the Elysian fields, the underworld, the shades, but none of them were vivid or credible enough to sustain a community under pressure. The Epicurean philosophers argued that the soul dispersed at death, like smoke, and that the appropriate response was to enjoy the present without fear. The Stoics taught that one should accept death with equanimity because it was natural and inevitable. These were noble and coherent positions, but they offered no particular reason to face death joyfully, and the martyrs faced death joyfully in a way that distinguished them from these philosophical frameworks. The early church's language about death was different because it was rooted in the resurrection. Death was not the end, and it was not merely an entrance into an undifferentiated afterlife. It was, in Paul's language, falling asleep, a temporary cessation before the resurrection of the body. The future that the martyrs were going toward was not a vague spiritual dissolution, but a bodily resurrection in a renewed world, a future modelled on what had happened to Jesus on the third day. The Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. This was not poetry. It was, for the early church, a claim about what was actually going to happen. This conviction that death was not the end, that the resurrection was real, that what had happened to Jesus would happen to everyone who was in him, gave the martyrs their composure. It gave the community its ability to maintain cohesion through persecution. It gave Paul his willingness to be shipwrecked and beaten and imprisoned and eventually executed. The faith did not spread in spite of the deaths of the people who carried it. The deaths of the people who carried it were part of why the faith spread, because the way they died communicated something about what they believed that words alone could not have communicated. Polycarp's last words before the fire was lit, asking God to be received as a perfect sacrifice on that day, are among the most moving in the literature of martyrdom. The account of Perpetua, a young noble woman in Carthage, nursing her infant son, refusing to recant and going to the arena in 203 AD with composure and even a kind of wonder, writing in her own diary about her visions and her preparation, is among the most intimate accounts of faith under pressure that any tradition has produced. Perpetua handed the infant to her family, prayed for the community, and walked into the arena. She was 22 years old. The account of her death circulated through the church and was read in North African churches for centuries afterward, alongside the scriptures themselves. These stories travelled. They were the early church's most powerful testimony to what the faith could do to a human being, and they were distributed through the same networks that distributed the letters and the Gospels. You could learn what Paul said about the resurrection, and then you could read about Perpetua dying in a way that suggested she actually believed what Paul said. The two forms of testimony reinforced each other. The doctrine gave the dying its meaning, and the dying gave the doctrine its credibility. The communities that formed around these stories, that remembered the names and preserved the accounts and built churches over the graves of the martyrs, were honouring not just the individuals, but what the individuals had demonstrated. They were saying, this is what the faith looks like when it is tested. This is what it looks like to actually believe what we claim to believe. And they were inviting every subsequent generation to measure their own faith against this template. The martyrs became, in death, more powerful advocates for the faith than they had been in life. Their deaths were final and irreversible in the way that their lives had not been. A person who dies for a belief cannot later recant, cannot be pressured into silence, cannot be made to say something different under duress. The martyr's witness is the most permanent form of testimony available to a human being. And the early church, almost from the beginning, understood this and built a tradition of veneration and commemoration around it that carried those testimonies forward. This is the full picture of the great Diaspora. Not only the roads and the ships and the trade routes and the networks of hospitality and the letters of Paul, but the deaths of the martyrs and the accounts of their deaths travelling through the networks. Not only the communities of care and mutual aid, but the practice of prayer in those communities sustained through every form of pressure the ancient world could apply. Not only the intellectual engagement of the apologists, but the physical embodiment of the faith in the lives of ordinary people going about their daily work. not only the official declarations of councils and the writings of theologians, but the anonymous cloth merchants and freed slaves and women of the households who made it possible for the councils and the writings to happen at all. The great diaspora was everything at once, all of it working together, none of it fully planned, all of it serving something that the people themselves experienced as larger than themselves. The wind blows wherever it pleases, Jesus had told Nicodemus in the middle of the night. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Where the wind blew, there the faith appeared, and the wind, it turned out, blew everywhere, including here, including now, including wherever you are as you listen to these words, in whatever hour has fallen around you. Thank you for spending this time in the ancient world with me. If the roads and the people and the long journey of this story have given you something to take into your sleep tonight, I am grateful. If you have a moment to leave a comment, where you are in the world, what time it is, what part of the journey most caught you, I would love to know. And if you want to keep walking these roads, please subscribe so you can find the next story when it comes. May you rest deeply and rise ready. Whatever road you are on, you are not alone on it. Good night. There is one final thing worth saying about the great diaspora before we let the night have its way. We have talked about mechanisms, roads and ships and networks of hospitality and letters and communities of care. We have talked about people, named and unnamed, the Phoebes and the men from Cyprus and Cyrene, and the Ethiopian official in his chariot. We have talked about the content of what they carried and the courage with which they carried it. But there is something underneath all of that which has not been fully named because it does not yield easily to historical analysis. The people who carried the faith across the ancient world were, by their own account, not primarily carrying an idea or a social program or a philosophical position. They were carrying a person. They were carrying the news of someone they believed to be alive. Everything else, the community, the ethics, the hope, the willingness to die, flowed from the central claim that a specific man who had been executed was no longer dead. This is what made the early Christian testimony different from every other religious movement of the ancient world. The mystery religions of the Greco-Roman world had their dying and rising gods, Osiris, Dionysus, Attis, but these were mythological cycles, not historical claims. The Stoics and Epicureans had their philosophies of how to live, but they were not claiming that their founder had recently walked out of a tomb. The Jewish tradition had its God who had acted in history, but the Messiah they were expecting had not yet come. The early Christians were claiming something historically specific. This happened, these people saw it, you can ask them. The power of that specificity was the power of testimony. Not argument, not philosophy, not the promise of a better life in this world, or a vague hope of something beyond it, but the direct testimony of witnesses. We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. This is Peter and John before the Sanhedrin, but it could be the summary of the entire early mission. They were speaking about what they had seen and heard, and when the original witnesses were gone, the communities they had founded preserved the testimonies, read them aloud in their gatherings, passed them on to their children, distributed them through their networks. The testimony kept travelling even after the witnesses were dead, because it had been written down and because there were communities committed to reading it and living it. The faith that spread across the ancient world was, at its root, a response to testimony. Ordinary people heard the testimony. Something happened in them when they heard it. They joined the community that was organised around it, and eventually they became part of the chain of testimony themselves. The chain has not broken in 2,000 years. It is still unbroken tonight. And at some point in the chain, far back or not so far, your own life was touched by it. And here you are, listening to the story, told again, at whatever hour has settled around you. The ancient world is gone. The roads are ruins or have been paved over into highways. The synagogues of the diaspora communities that first heard the gospel have been destroyed and rebuilt 100 times. The ships that carried Paul across the Aegean have long since rotted or sunk. The arena where Polycarp died is a grassy depression in the hillside above modern Izmir. The pit of Khor Virap in Armenia is now a monastery. The stele of Xi'an is in a museum, but the testimony is still here. The communities are still here. The reading of the scriptures is still happening somewhere on earth, in every hour of every day. The bread and wine are still being shared. The baptisms are still being performed. The sick are still being cared for. The grief is still being comforted with the same words Paul used to comfort the Thessalonians about their dead. We do not grieve like the rest of mankind, who have no hope. That is what the great diaspora gave to the world. Not the empire, not the buildings, not the institutions, though all of those have their place in the story. What it gave to the world was hope. The specifically shaped, historically grounded, resurrection-rooted hope that has sustained human beings through 2,000 years of everything the world could throw at them. And that hope has found its way by whatever roads and ships and testimonies and communities and letters were available to it in each generation, to wherever you are listening from tonight. The diaspora is still happening. You are part of it. And now, at last, it is time to rest.